their accounts of being abducted by greys and reptilians and aliens. You look at the ancient texts and the religious texts where they're talking about angels taking people up into the sky, describing basically the same thing. Now, I've become known and massively ridiculed for talking about a reptilian dimension to human manipulation, which is brought down in the newspapers to reptiles around the world. It's a little bit more than subtle than that, but there you go. Well, I'll take it. And of course, what I've had as a result of that is enormous ridicule. And I've got to tell you, it does hurt. It does. You know, I've lay awake at night many times, very hurt by what they've said about me, just because I'm speaking my truth. Well, actually, I'm not, if I'm honest. I've not. I don't give a shit. I want to know what's going on. Don't want to have a pedestal put in my name. Antifa would knock it down anyway. The far right would knock it down for sure. Condemnation without investigation is the height of ignorance, Einstein said, and that's what happens. People dismiss things because they're not on the postage stamp. Normal is only what we normally experience. We don't normally experience reptilian entities. Billions of a pinhead, let's just open our minds a bit. And the funny thing is when scientists say not exactly the same thing, but very close, but they're taken bloody seriously in the papers. This is a British mainstream newspaper. Welcome to our new lizard overlords. Study suggests alien worlds could be full of super intelligent dinosaurs. It's a bloke, a scientist out of America, saying that he reckons that these entities exist. And they did a study in America, in the Carolinas, of what the dinosaurs would look like now if they had died out. I'm not saying that they come from dinosaurs, but they did this study. And they came to the conclusion that they would be humanoid, reptilian, intelligent beings now. If you look in the East, the whole focus of their culture is the dragon, the reptile. And a great friend of mine, Credo Mutwa, who's in his 90s now, the Zulu shaman, he told me a long time ago about the Chitahuri, the children of the serpent, the devastators, as they call them, in Zulu legend, who were a reptilian race manipulating human society. And he painted this as one of the worker class of the Chitahuri, as he called them. And in 2010, I was in Barcelona, and I met this guy. He actually was brought to meet me, and he was an artist. And he had a partner, a girlfriend, who was Brazilian. And one time, he just before that, he was in Brazil, and he went out into the landscape on his own, away from everybody. And he put up his easel and he started painting the landscape. And he said this craft came down about 50 meters across. I mean, this guy was into none of this stuff. And he said there were two windows of it open and it hovered in front of him. And there were two entities standing at the window. And he painted them while they were there. He had his easel. And he painted the craft, and he produced a little book of paintings that he did that day. Because he said they stayed there about 2 hours. There was no one else around. And what he painted was very much like the paintings that Credo Mutwa does of the Chitahuri. And this virus infects different forms, and therefore they behave according to its distorted state. And when people who've been abducted by these entities, when they describe them and their behavior and their attitudes, they describe them in terms of how the Gnostics describe the Archontic force. Because these, I say, are physical expressions or form expressions of that force. And long after I talked about the reptilians and the whole thing about that, and I've been publishing them since the 1990s, came across this article in Nexus magazine out of Australia in 2011, I think it was. And it told the story by a whistleblower of something called the Chani project, computer interface communication with other realms. And what it described was a project from 1994 for 5 years at a kind of mini CERN, a secret mini CERN in Africa, where they made a computer connection to another realm and communicated with an entity in another dimension of reality and asked it enormous numbers of questions over those 5 years. And this is what, I didn't read it for this, I was just reading it out of interest, and then I saw this. The entity said, a reptilian race was holding back humans so they couldn't grow. The entity said they had fought many battles against the reptile race in their own reality. Humans were more involved spiritually than the reptiles, but they suppress humans with their technology. Their God is their technology. That will become very relevant at the end of this section. Carl Sagan, the great cosmologist, was so convinced of the reptilian connection, the reptilian genetic impact, as it would be for him, on human behavior, that he wrote a book, Dragons of Eden, in which he said you cannot understand human behavior without looking at the reptilian genetic makeup of humans. Because, as most people don't know, that one of the most important and pivotal in terms of behavior and perception parts of the brain is called the reptilian brain, or the R complex. It has a massive impact on human behavior. It's constantly scanning the environment for danger and threats to survival. It's constantly in a state of anxiety. And according to mainstream science, from this reptilian brain, which everyone has, we get cold-blooded behavior and territoriality, a desire to control, an obsession with hierarchical structures of power, which is how the world is structured. Aggression, might is right, winner takes all. And from there we get primitive and emotional responses. We're getting more and more emotional response instead of factual response. It's said that the reptilian brain is where comes protecting status, power, reputation, superiority, intellectual preeminence, and in another expression of the reptilian brain, acquiescence to hierarchy and authority. And if you look at the Bible and many other ancient texts, they talk about a negative force in reptilian terms. And the great dragon was cast out, that old serpent called the devil and Satan, who deceiveth the whole world. He was cast out into the earth, and his angels, archons, were cast out with him. The Jewish religion has the holy serpent, or Leviathan. And this guy, Reverend John Bathurst Dean, he wrote a book in 1933 called Worship of the Serpent. He studied worship of the serpent all over the world. And this was his conclusion. It appears then that no nations were so geographically remote and so religiously discordant, but that one and only one superstitious characteristic was common to all, and that the most civilized and the most barbarous bowed down with the same devotion to the same engrossing deity, and that this deity either was or was represented by the same sacred serpent. It appears also that in most, if not all, the civilized countries where this serpent was worshipped, some fable or tradition which involved his history directly or indirectly alluded to the fall of man in paradise, in which the serpent was concerned. What follows then, but that the most ancient account respecting the cause and nature of this seduction must be the one from which all the rest are derived, which represent the victorious serpent, victorious over man in a state of innocence, and subduing his soul in a state of sin, as he would see it, into the most abject and veneration and adoration of himself. And so, the fall. He's saying that the fall is invariably connected to some kind of reptilian force or imagery. And this book was written by a British academic a few years ago, Steve Taylor, from a university in Leeds. and he called it the Fall. And what he was documenting was a point about 6,000 years ago when human behavior dramatically changed in a very short period. He points out that there was no war as we know it before 4000 BC, 6,000 years ago. There was no patriarchal society until that same period. No massive inequality. You can see the graves of that time. They're equal, they're not hierarchical. There was no class system as we know it. There were no gods and organized religion in the way that we know them. And this change came with violent invasions of Indo-European and Semitic peoples into the Middle East. And Semitic peoples. Oh, that's Jewish. Well, actually, Semitic is a word to describe a series of languages, a language group in the Middle East and North Africa, the overwhelming majority of which are Arabic languages. Even the term anti-Semitic is an inversion of its true meaning. Rian Eisler, a cultural historian, talking about this 6,000 years ago period, 4000 BC, said it was the great change, a change so great indeed that nothing in all we know of human cultural evolution is comparable in magnitude. Something dramatically changed. Now, this guy, William Tompkins, produced a book in 2015, long after I've been talking about this reptilian dimension, since the 90s. And he says that he was seconded into a top secret American naval intelligence operation operating overwhelmingly out of the naval base in San Diego, which was basically looking at the extraterrestrial threat situation with Earth and humanity, human society. And he produced this book in 2015 describing what he saw. And he produces many pictures with him or with the kind of people that he said he worked with. Now, what he says in this book is that virtually every world government is controlled by a reptilian race. I've been saying that for long before. And he said that this reptilian takeover started 6,000 years ago, which absolutely fits with this, what was called the new psyche that emerged out of the Middle East, when we went from a heart society to a belly society. And Taylor calls in the book this area Saharasia, and he calls it the new psyche after 6,000 years ago. And from Saharasia, this new psyche went off in all directions. It went up into Europe, across to the Americas, down into Africa, with the British Empire, out to Australia, out into the East. And the new psyche, whenever it came across the indigenous peoples, it wanted to destroy them. As Trader Mutwa said to me, they came in and they wanted to milk the shaman for their knowledge and then kill them so it wouldn't be passed on. And you can follow the movement of this new psyche out of the Middle East to create the Roman Empire, and eventually it was the force behind the British Empire and the European empires. And when they went in, like I say, these indigenous peoples, they wanted to destroy them, and they wanted to destroy their knowledge, and they wanted to destroy their ways of perceiving, because still they were decoding reality in a different way. Thus, they were much more aware of deeper reality than the new psyche was, which was basically 5 sense left brain psyche. And one of these people who thought in this different way was a guy called Don Juan Matus, who was the source of the Carlos Castaneda books, which Castaneda wrote from the 1960s through to the 1990s. And Don Juan Matus said this in Castaneda's final book. We have a predator that came from the depth of the cosmos. He was a Central American shaman and took over the rule of our lives. Human beings are its prisoners. The predator is our lord and master. It has rendered us docile, helpless. If we want to protest, it suppresses our protest. If we want to act independently, it demands that we don't do so. Indeed, we are held prisoner. They took us over because we are food to them, and they squeeze us mercilessly because we are their sustenance. Just as we rear chickens in coops, the predators rear us in human coops, human eros. Therefore, their food is always available to them. Think for a moment and tell me how you would explain the contradictions between the intelligence of man, the engineer, and the stupidity of his systems of belief, or the stupidity of his contradictory behavior. I'll explain that before we finish this section. Sorcerers believe that the predators have given us our systems of beliefs, our ideas of good and evil, our social mores. They are the ones who set up our dreams of success or failure. They have given us covetousness, greed, and cowardice. It is the predator who makes us complacent, routinary, and egomaniacal. In order to keep us obedient and meek and weak, the predators engage themselves in a stupendous maneuver. Stupendous, of course, from the point of view of a fighting strategist, a horrendous maneuver from the point of those who suffer it. They gave us their mind. The predator's mind is baroque, contradictory, morose, filled with the fear of being discovered any minute now. Because once we suss it, their food source is over. They gave us their mind. They gave us their counterfeit spirit. They gave us their minds. He goes on, sorcerers of ancient Mexico reasoned that man must have been a complete being at one point, with stupendous insights, feats of awareness that are mythological legends nowadays. And then everything seems to disappear and we now have a sedated man. What I'm saying is that what we have against us is not a simple predator. It is very smart and organized. It follows a methodical system to render us useless. Man, the magical being that he is destined to be, is no longer magical. He's an average piece of meat. There are no more dreams for man, but the dreams of an animal who is being raised to be a piece of meat. Trite, conventional, imbecilic. Precisely. So, how do we get there? The next stage of this, create your own bloodline network that represents you in human society, that is a vehicle for you to manipulate human society. And we have what they call today elite bloodlines. These are, in effect, the 1% or less than 1%, and that which represents and works for the agenda of the 1%. And these bloodlines are the full-blown counterfeit spirit. Humans still have another level of consciousness, potentially expanded awareness, that can overwhelm the impulses of the counterfeit spirit. That's why so many people are not affected by it in anything like the way other people are. But these bloodlines were full-blown counterfeit spirit, full-blown psychopaths, which is why they do what they do. They have no emotional consequence for what they do. People in any kind of expanded awareness could not drop bombs on innocent people simply to advance an agenda. But if you have no emotional consequence for what you do, there are no limits to what you do. And these bloodlines through the ages, the ones we have today, some of them, are the ones that end up in the positions of power in the top of this hierarchy. And they are like in-betweeners, middlemen and women. Symbolically, if you're a scientist and you can't work with something that's dangerous in this sense, it can't work in this reality because it's on a different frequency. It has to somehow take form to impact upon it. Then the scientist stands outside the sealed tank and uses these long gloves to work inside the sealed tank. If you take the scientists to be this archontic and reptilian